Okay, so it happened at Iconium, or in Iconium, that they went together to the synagogue of the Jews and so spoke that a great multitude, both of the Jews and of the Greeks, believed. All right, so lots of people believed, and this is, of course, at the synagogue. They always started at the synagogue. Why would they start at the synagogue? Yeah, of all the people that should have easily accepted this message, it should have been the Jewish people because of their background and the teachings. And so that's a perfect place to start. And it just makes sense. You want to go where this is going to be most receptive. But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brethren. Therefore, they stayed there a long time, speaking boldly in the Lord, who was bearing witness to the word of his grace, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. All right, here's an example of this. I've mentioned it before, that there are a lot of times you're going to see in text, you'll see phrases that are descriptive. And this one here at the end, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands, is an example of that. And it starts with a gerund. It's a participial phrase. And I know this is an English class, but it's simply stated. It is giving us, it's an adverbial phrase. That an adverbial phrase, all it does is answers the question how. So when you see that, you can often, if you see a word ending in ing and it's part of a phrase, it's the beginning of a phrase, you can often ask how, or this is going to answer the question how. So you're going to look at what it's talking about as a description of how these things are happening. So the how is granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. The what is bearing witness to the word of his grace. So they're bearing witness to the word. How are they doing that? By granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. This is how God is doing that. And so God is bearing witness to the word of his grace. And he's doing that through the signs and wonders. And that reinforces, again, what we said all along, that miracles were done specifically for the reason of proving that God's word is true. And of course, there are also other reasons involved, like compassion, right? But the main reason is for that. But the multitude of the city was divided. Part sided with the Jews and part with the apostles. And when a violent attempt was made by both the Gentiles and Jews with their rulers to abuse and stone them, they became aware of it and fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, and to the surrounding region. And they were preaching the gospel. All right, so what was the reason Paul and Barnabas stayed a long time in Iconium? Sorry? The people needed to hear it. Yeah? Yeah, they obviously needed to hear it because of the problems that were being caused. There's maybe more to it than that. Does it actually state in here the reason that they stayed a long time? It says, therefore, they stayed there a long time. It's interesting because what is the word therefore? What does it tell us to do? To look at the words before, right? What is it saying before the therefore? Exactly what Michael said. The unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brethren. Therefore, they stayed there a long time. So they didn't back away from the challenge. Why would it be so important for them? Does it indicate here, let's put it this way, did it indicate here that they stayed around so they could fight with the people who were arguing with them? Is that the reason they stayed? Why would it be necessary for them to stay if the Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their mind against the brethren? What are they doing? Setting the record straight, right? They're there to encourage and help the Christians that were there, right? You don't just convert people and then abandon them when things get rough. But sometimes you have to do that. But in this case, they didn't have to do that. They didn't do that because of they wanted to stick around because there was such turmoil and trouble there. So we got to stick with this. All right. But then it says in verse 4, the multitude of the cities was divided, part sided with the Jews and part with the apostles. So now they're The city was divided. The whole city's talking about this and engaged in it to some degree. I'm sure there's people on the outskirts looking around, trying to figure out what's actually happening. But there's a lot of discussion in here. You can imagine in a small town, of somebody coming in, and there's all this ruckus that is caused by it. People are going to be talking all over the place. All right, so. And it says in verse 5, when a violent attempt was made by both the Jews, the Gentiles and the Jews with the rulers to abuse and stone them, they became aware of it and fled. All right, so why would they then flee if they were there because of they were there to support the Christians who were being attacked, basically? Why would they then leave when it got hot? They might have died if they stayed. Yeah. So it changed from a battle of words to a battle of stones and sticks. Yeah. So, I mean, this is one of those eternal questions that come up when you're door knocking, right? Have you ever, I think, what is his name that did our seminar for us? Rob, thank you. Went blank. I was thinking Eddie for some reason. Rob, I think he mentioned this. We have what we call exercising the Passover, right? That is, you come to a house and you got to make a decision. You see a big dog. Or worse, you see a fence with all the trappings of a dog, but you don't see the dog anywhere. And then you don't know what you're getting into. You got to decide, am I going to take the chance, or am I going to apply the Passover and go to the next house, right? And you have to make those kinds of decisions. Which one's the right one? I don't know. I do think that we have to be aware of why we're making decisions, and we can't allow fear to always control us. But I've got plenty of stories where I went in. There's one example. I went into this person's front yard. The gate was wide open, so I just walked in and knocked on the door, and they had some kind of a Rottweiler or something. They let it out the back door, and it came to the front at the fence at the gate. So I couldn't get out. We hopped the fence. So there's all kinds of things that can happen. I got some doozies, I can tell you. You knock as many doors as I have, and you're going to see some things. But however, there are a lot of times where we look at a house and go, I don't think I'm going to even step on their lawn, right? And so how do you decide that? I don't know. Common sense. I mean, and they had the situation here where there was a lot of excitement about them being there, a lot of anger, a lot of tempers flying, and they said, we're going to stick around just because of that. But then they heard that there's going to get really bad. They decided, all right, it's time for us to get out of here now. So at some point, we got to make some decisions, and it's not always easy to do. But sometimes we make the wrong ones, and the interesting thing about that is we don't ever know. Maybe in eternity we'll get to know if those are good decisions or not. But then, so they left, and I'm certainly not going to fault them for doing that. But because a violent attempt was made to abuse and stone them, so evidently they were coming together for that particular purpose, and then so they got out and left, and they preached the gospel there in that region, the cities of Lycaonia and the surrounding region. They were preaching the gospel there. And in Lystra, a certain man without strength in his feet was sitting, a cripple from his mother's womb who had never walked. This man heard Paul speaking. Paul, observing him intently and seeing that he had faith to be healed, said with a loud voice, "Stand up, straight on your feet." And he leaped and walked. Now, let me ask you a question here. Is it possible that he could heal this man if that man had no faith? Robert says yes. I'm going to go with that. You know what the faith healers would tell you? If it didn't work, it's because you didn't believe enough. I've read that there were a lot of people who have been raised from the dead. And you can't tell me they believed. They had no idea what was going on, but it still happened, right? The power is not in the person's belief. The power is in God, okay? But here's an interesting thing. It says that he observed him intently, and seeing that he had faith to be healed, that's when he acted. Why would it be important for him to recognize? First of all, how do you see that someone has the faith to be healed? What would be an indicator? His attitude, right? So at the time, Paul is speaking, right, and he's talking about these great things of God. So you might see that he's intently listening, maybe. I tell you, there's nothing like when we have visitors or people in the audience that they're not Christians, and they're sitting on the edge of their seat listening to you. That's a very good thing. It's a very good feeling too, but it's a very good thing because you see that they're absorbing and they're listening, right? So faith is starting to develop and grow. So he could see this in him. He's really paying attention to him, and he saw that he had the faith to be healed. Now, why would it be important that he had faith to be healed? Okay, so maybe the man is seeking to be healed, and he recognizes that. Sure. Why would it matter? Why would Paul be looking around for an opportunity to heal somebody? Do you think he was doing that? It says he was intently watching this guy. Right. He wanted the opportunity to do something to prove point what he's saying. So now he has an opportunity. He's looking at this guy, and here's the perfect opportunity. I'm not suggesting that Paul wasn't compassionate toward the man. I mean, it's obvious that he was, but he also had another motive. He's going to show God's power, right, to this man. Yeah, Robert? Somebody could be a good witness of the things that had happened. Yeah, because everyone would know that he's lame, right? In fact, it said he was a cripple from his mother's womb, had never walked. What do you think his legs looked like, by the way? I've seen people in bed for my grandfather was in bed for 12 years before he passed away, and there was nothing left of his legs, his arms. He was just skin and bone, basically. I can't imagine what he looked like, but this is a situation where now it's important. If you look at verse 10, it's important that Paul recognized that this man had the faith to be healed, because he said, stand up straight on your feet. And what did the man do? He did it. So what would have happened if he would have just randomly walked up to someone and said, hey, stand up on your feet, and the guy just looked up and laughed at him? It wouldn't have really had the same impact, right? But now he saw that this man here's a great opportunity. I think we can learn some lessons from that. Not that obviously we're going to go heal anyone, but we ought to be looking for opportunity, and when we see that, we ought to take advantage of opportunities to help. Great prospect. Yeah, that's right. So anyway, when the people saw what Paul had done, they raised their voices, saying in the Lycaonian language, the gods have come down to us in the likeness of men. And Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. All right. Now, why did the people of Lystra think that Paul and Barnabas were gods? I think it's a pretty obvious question, right? Because they did this great thing. And there is I'll get into this, some notes I saw from Nelson Bible Study here in just a minute. But what does it say about Barnabas that they called him Zeus and Paul Hermes? Look at verse 12. They called Paul Hermes. Why? Because he was the chief speaker. All right. What do you know about the relationship? I know this is not about gods. This is about God. But these are Greek gods, right? What do you know about these two gods, Zeus and Hermes? Do you know what the relationship? Sorry? Hermes was the messenger of Zeus. All right. So if Hermes is the messenger of Zeus, he's the one that talks the most. That's why they call Paul Hermes. What does that tell us about the relationship of Paul and Barnabas in the work? Barnabas didn't say much. Paul did all the talking. And so when they saw how they interacted and Paul did all the talking, they assumed that Barnabas was Zeus and Paul was Hermes. Now, it's very ironic in many ways, but one of the ironies is that we always see as who's the one in the lead, Paul. And we see him as he's in the lead because he's the one speaking. They saw it completely different. And if you're a great God, you wouldn't stoop to speaking to people. You're going to send someone else to do it for you. So anyway, that's the kind of the situation that they're facing here. And it says then that Barnabas he called Zeus and Paul Hermes because he was the chief speaker. Then the priest of Zeus, whose temple was in front of their city, so there's one of the reasons they called him Zeus, because they happened to have a temple there. They brought oxen and garlands to the gate, intending to sacrifice with the multitudes. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard this, they tore their clothes and ran in among the multitude, crying out and saying, "Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men with the same nature as you, and preach to you that you should turn from these useless things to the living God, who made the heaven and the earth, the sea, and all things that are in them." All right, so their reaction is what we would expect to see, right? That there's no way they're going to allow them to make sacrifices to them. But in actuality, there may be people today or even back then who would have allowed it. So that's an interesting lesson for us, and it's not something that we would. Sacrifices today wouldn't be that, but what's an example of that we might see today? Any idea? Preacheritis. That's a good one. Preacheritis is I wouldn't say the worship of a preacher, but if a preacher says it, it's got to be true. Or this preacher says it and this one doesn't, so there's a fight between, well, this preacher's greater. I've seen debates where they're getting up trying to prove a point, and their whole proof was that brother so-and-so said this. It doesn't matter what brother so-and-so said. It matters what this says, right? But sometimes we get into that kind of mindset. So they're going to do something even worse than that. They're actually offering a sacrifice to them. They're going to try to, and so they fall on their knees and convince them not to do it. This is an interesting situation. According to Nelson Study Bible in their notes, it says that there's a Roman poet named Ovid who told of an ancient legend in which Zeus and Hermes came down to earth. All right, so similar situation. This is before Paul and Barnabas were there. They tried to lodge with people in 1,000 houses, but were rejected each time. So 1,000 places, no one would take them in. They finally found an old rundown house with an elderly couple living in there that allowed them to stay. And as a reward, the gods made the house into a beautiful temple and destroyed the houses of all those who rejected them. So they destroyed all the other houses and built this magnificent temple in honor of this older couple. So what kind of a lesson does that teach you? If you see two men come into town and they're doing godlike things, what are you going to do? You're going to pull out all the stops. You're going to have a parade for them. You're going to learn the lesson, right? So that's part of the reason why they're doing all this. And they want to be just in case, right? Just in case it really is them, we're gonna make sure we honor them. And so now Paul and Barnabas are tearing their clothes, asking them, "Don't do this." In verse 16, he says, "Who in bygone generations allowed all nations to walk in their own ways." It's speaking of God, of course. "Nevertheless, he did not leave himself without witness, and that he did good, gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness. And with these things, they could scarcely restrain the multitudes from sacrificing to them." Now, you're familiar with this. If you're familiar with this passage and study of Acts, what does this sermon, or this, I guess it's a sermon in a way, what does that remind you? Does it remind you of any other sermon that you've heard of? People where? Oh, yeah, that's a little further back than I was thinking. That's a little further back than I was thinking. I'm thinking Book of Acts. Mars Hill. We'll get there to it. We're not there yet. But what that tells me is they had something already ready. They already had the speech prepared for when they run upon Gentiles who don't know anything about God. Now they already know what they're going to say. And so there's similar things coming out. And I don't know if it started developing here. They started realizing they did have something or what, but it is interesting that they had, preachers have this neat ability, especially if they go from one place to the next. You know what they tend to do? The same sermon. Why? Because by the time you do 20 or 30 of them, you're really good at it, right? That's why preachers do it. But honestly, really, it makes sense. If you're going to go from one place to the next, they haven't heard this. You're going to go in. What are you going to do? You're going to say the same thing, so with different words. So it makes sense that everywhere they went, they're basically saying the same message. And they ran across Gentiles. They're going to say basically the same thing. We see evidence of that here and also in Acts chapter 19 when we get there. But anyway, it's just a side note. But it doesn't really take away from anything if you said it. I don't know if any of y'all can relate to that, but I've struggled with that at times. It's like I've been places and I'm preaching the same lessons, and I think I'm cheating them, but actually, it's still the Bible, right? So you can still do that kind of thing, and it's never the same twice anyway. As long as the preacher hadn't been there 30 years. If you do that, you have to preach it backwards the next time. People never catch that. Okay, so he tells them he tells them these things and convinces them not to do it, but barely. Verse 18, with these things they could scarcely restrain the multitudes from sacrificing to them. Then Jews from Antioch and Iconium came there, and having persuaded the multitudes, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing him to be dead. All right, so what is it that convinced the people of Lystra to stone Paul? Why? I mean, it says that they came in, but why would they be so easily swayed? Look at the extreme of what's going on. What were they just about to do? They're about to worship this man and sacrifice to him, and then they all of a sudden, seemingly within an hour, now they're taking him outside and stoning him to death. How does that happen? Such a swing. They're not God, so they were disappointed. So they. So they could be using that kind of say these people they're teaching false ideas. I mean, look at what they're teaching you. You thought one thing, and they were trying to convince you another. Yeah, that's a possibility. It's just amazing when you see things like this. It's not the first time you see people do such a 180, is it? This is people. This is humans, and we can turn on each other like that. That's reality. So, unfortunately, that's one of the things that humans are good at doing. It didn't take very long at all, though, with them. The thinking I had, another example of that was, what were they saying when Jesus came into Jerusalem the last time? Hosanna in the highest, right? And then how long was it before they were saying crucify him? Not long at all. Not long at all. So people can turn on very, very quickly, turn on a dime. Yeah. So now I'm mad because they had all these expectations of being able to worship Zeus, and you just crushed that, right? Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's always some kind of a trigger. When that trigger is there, it can change quickly. And then if you have the Jewish people coming in, these are not the ones that were following Jesus, right? Obviously, they're coming in. What are they doing while they're there? they're poisoning their minds too. They're throwing gasoline on the fire. They found an opportunity now, and they're going to strike while the iron's hot. So anyway, let's see how many of those the speech I can use at one time. So he, why did you think they stoned Paul and not Barnabas? Didn't they think that Barnabas was Zeus? Maybe Barnabas wasn't there. Paul was the one talking. Yeah, that's a good point. Yep. If you keep your mouth shut, I have a plaque in my office that even a fish will stay out of trouble if you keep his mouth shut. Yeah. Now, sometimes, though, you got to open your mouth. I'm not saying you shouldn't, but that's probably the reason. He wasn't actually saying anything. He escaped by that much. And so Paul, I don't know how the stoning happened. I've seen people say that they would use huge stones. I've seen other people say that they would use ones like a softball size. I don't know. However they did it, it's not any way I'd want to go. Yeah. Depending on how far away you were and what you had available, probably. Say it again. Yeah, the question is, did he die or not? But you're right. He did walk away from it, so it probably wasn't big, huge things. There's no way of knowing. So it says supposing him to be dead. So they're supposing it, and so you could read into that is he wasn't really dead, but he could have been, that they thought he was. But then it says that, however, when the disciples gathered around him, he rose up and went into the city, and the next day he departed with Barnabas to Derbe. So the next question is, what did Paul do after getting up from being stoned? He went right back into the same city. I think I would have gone down the road, right? But this is pretty amazing to me. He wasn't afraid of losing his life. Might have done it discreetly. That's right. And he could have snuck into someone's house. That's right. But it still took some guts to go back in there. I've got to give him props for that one for sure. Yeah. And we don't know actually what happened. I mean, it could have been that one of the brethren touched him and healed him. I think it probably would have said it if that's the case. And he could have been dead and came back. It could have simply been almost dead. We don't have any idea. Right. Yeah. Yeah, Isaac. That's probably where they took him. Yeah, because they gathered around him from that place, and they were probably right there. They saw everything that happened, most likely. Yeah, that's true. That's where he would have been taken the most care of from there. Somebody said it. What do you think he looked like? Pretty beat up. Pretty beat up. Yeah, he looked like he was dead. Did he avoid Lystra after this? No. You know what he did when he came back through? What was he teaching about? Look at what it says here. When they had preached the gospel, verse 21, to that city and made many disciples, they returned to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch, strengthening the souls of the disciples, exhorting them to continue in the faith, and saying, we must, through many tribulations, enter the kingdom of God. What was his message? We've got to go through it all. Yeah. And now that's a strong, powerful lesson when you realize that we have danger, right? And even if we face dangers today, there's dangers of getting out, right? It's one thing to say and recognize that there's danger, and there's other thing when you have bruises and scars and broken bones, and you're standing up, and people have remember what it looks like you being stoned to death outside the gates, and you're saying, we've all got to go through this. Man, that's powerful. That's exactly what we should say when we go through trials and tribulations and problems. We overcome them, and we tell other people about them, because that can be a help to them as well. I'm sure that Paul probably has let slip more than once that he had been stoned. It's not something you go around bragging about, but when people find out about what you've been through, it helps encourage them. So an even better situation would be when you see brothers or sisters and they're suffering and struggling, and you've been through something similar, right? What do? I've been there. You can get through it. We got to get through it. This is part of it. Let's go through it, right? Let's get through it together. And in that sense, I know you understand what I'm saying, but it sounds very strange to say. In that sense, some of those things that we go through are a blessing, because it allows us the connection with other people who go also. We have a lot of things in common as Christians, don't we? A lot of great things and a lot of bad things, and all of it works together. Yeah, Paul? Sure. So she was on her deathbed, basically, for 3 months, and she wrote a blog to encourage people who are to live life the best they could. Yeah, that would be a powerful statement. Yeah, that would be. Is that chapter 1? Oh, okay. 2 Corinthians 1, 3 through 4. Exactly. So we're comforted so that we can comfort others. And this is where this is part of our lot, if I can say it that way, where we find people who have been through similar challenges that we've been through. You haven't been through things I have, and I haven't been through things you have. There are a lot of other people around who've been through things exactly like you have. And you can be an influence and a help a lot to them. That's part of who we are. So we got through it. Our duty then is to help encourage and say, you can get through it too. And if you're looking for how to approach different people and how to get outside of your shell and be an aid to others, that's the best way to start. Just start where you are with where you've been. And it takes courage. It takes guts to talk about where you've been, because it's scary, and you're going to think people are judging you, and they will. And you're going to think that it's not going to amount to anything. And you're going to remember and rehash things that are hard for you to go through. But there will be people that benefit, and you can be a great asset to them. It helps with your healing. Yes, it certainly does. When you are able to help someone else heal, it helps heal you as well. And there's wounds that are never, ever completely healed. But every time you share and interact with people and make that connection, you get a little bit more salve. It's just, and it's nice. It's good. All right. So that's what Paul's going through. And it's just a great example of how we can do as Christians. And obviously, we are not looking for trouble, but when we find it, it can actually be to our advantage. Isn't that what Romans chapter 8 says? It can be to our advantage. Then it goes on and says, verse 23, so when they had appointed elders in every church and prayed with fasting, they commended them to the Lord in whom they had believed. And after they had passed through Pisidia and came to Pamphylia. Now, when they had preached the word in Perga, they went down to Italia, and from there they sailed to Antioch, where they had been commended to the grace of God for the work which they had completed. When they had come and gathered the church together, they reported all that God had done with them and how that he had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles. So they stayed there a long time with the disciples. How is it then, verse 23, that they could have elders so fast? I look at that and I get jealous a little bit. So how is that possible? And I realize it was the age of miracles. And it is possible that people had miraculous ability. I don't read of any miraculous manifestation that's called elder, but they were given wisdom, they were given knowledge, they were given the ability to discern between right and wrong. So there were some of that was going on. But how else could you explain that they could have people who are not novices in the faith who are new Christians? They what? They worked really hard. Yeah, I could imagine that. I think that if you think of it in the sense of not a novice, which Paul says in 1 Timothy, or Titus 1, I can't remember which one of the two. We're talking about who are the ones that were mostly being converted? Jew or Gentile? Jews. They were the first, at least, in every place. So they had a lot of opportunity to. What do we know then about the Jewish religion compared to Christianity? Very similar, right? There's a lot of overlap. So there are a lot of people who are coming into the Christian faith who knew a whole lot about the scriptures already. How much Bible, how much New Testament did Paul have when he was in Lystra and Derbe? Just what was in his mind, right? What the Holy Spirit is giving him. He didn't have a New Testament. What scriptures did they have to have a good foundation in? The Old Testament. Why? Because it was the foundation for the New. And so when they grew up learning the scriptures, they weren't a novice to the Bible when they became Christians. Now, there were some new things that they had learned, but you could see how that could be very easy for them to find someone who would be qualified to be a leader and help people understand the Bible better. So that's, I think, part of the reason. And then, of course, when they went back to Antioch, which is their starting point, they were commended. They had been commended to the grace of God for the work which they had completed. So they went back there, and they gathered the whole church together. They reported all that God had done with them, and that He'd opened the door of faith to the Gentiles. That was something that was people knew about, but hadn't heard a lot about, right? So Paul is doing a lot of groundbreaking work by introducing the Gentiles. And there was a lot of problems. There were a lot of problems with that Jew-Gentile relationship that they had to figure out. They didn't have Galatians to look up, right? They had to figure it out pretty much on their own with God's help. And that's what the next chapter gets into. We get into the conflict over circumcision. That was one of the big ones. Did they have to be a Jew first before they could be a Christian? And some people were going around saying, yes, you had to, and others saying no. So the question is, how do you decide that? So we'll talk about that next week, and hopefully we can get into some of the discussion about how to make those kinds of decisions and what actually was going on there. Any comments or questions about this chapter? How much time was there? I have no idea. There was obviously some gap, but it doesn't really. You're right, and it doesn't say. It says the next day he departed to Derbe in verse 20. He made many disciples in verse 21, and then he returned. But I mean, he can make many disciples in a weekend, right? It doesn't sound like he was there for a long period of time, but I would say easily a couple months. And that I think stretching it would be even to say longer than that. I mean, I'm thinking it's a pretty relatively short period of time. And then he comes back and establishes elders. So I don't know. Good question. Any other comments or thoughts? Well, thanks for the discussion. That was good. We'll start there next week, Lord willing.